Yeah. I won't be happy.
Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, we would appreciate that last courtesy check that your various mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. For those watching online now or in the future, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Leading our discussion today and discussing the release of our current Index on Culture and Opportunity will be Jennifer Marshall. Ms. Marshall is Vice President for our Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity. She also serves Heritage as the Joseph C. and Elizabeth A. Anderlich Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Jen Marshall. Jen?
Thank you, John, and thanks all of you for being here. Well, 2016 was quite a year, and it revealed some deep unsettling in the American population. The unease many feel about our future, their families, their communities, the country in general, was palpable. We often hear about job numbers and wage numbers in relation to these anxieties, but they go much deeper than economics. Across America, the marriage rate is declining, church attendance is drifting downward, and we've also seen the increase of unwed childbearing and teen drug use over the course of the last decade. Family and faith have had an enormous impact in grounding and directing generation after generation through human history. It's no wonder that the erosion of family and faith would inevitably lead to unsettling. We can't afford to ignore these realities as we have a conversation about opportunity in America. And yet, too often, we do ignore them. And that's why at the Heritage Foundation, we have published the Index of Culture and Opportunity to change that. Most conversations about opportunity begin and end with economic indicators. But opportunity begins much earlier, much closer to home, much closer to the heart. Early in a child's life, family and community have a lot to do with whether he or she will be able to reach and grab hold of the opportunities offered by education and economic freedom later in life. Well, the 2017 Index of Culture and Opportunity tells this story. It tracks 31 indicators of culture, poverty and independence, education, and the economy. We invited commentary on these trend lines from heritage scholars, researchers at other think tanks and universities, journalists, community leaders, and one thoughtful member of Congress. Today we'll be joined by 5 of these contributors on a panel a little later in the program. Some of the challenges highlighted in the index require government action. Tackling, for instance, the ballooning growth of food stamp dependency requires policy changes to encourage work. That's what Representative Jim Jordan has to say in his commentary in this year's index. After all, as syndicated columnist Cal Thomas points out in his essay in this index, handouts with no expectation of personal responsibility rob individuals of their dignity. Now, while a number of challenges identified in the index require policy fixes, nearly all of them call out for community and interpersonal efforts as well. And we're going to hear about that more from our keynote speaker today. So high rates of prisoner recidivism, for example, won't be changed without communities committing to reintegrating ex-offenders. John Ponder shows how to do that, telling the story of his Las Vegas-based Hope for Prisoners project in the index. Well, the importance of family and faith to such community efforts is highlighted in numerous contributions to this year's index. So it's appropriate that we have dedicated the index as a whole to a great American whose extraordinary personal example and support have meant a great deal to us here at Heritage and to countless others across the country, and that is Bill Simon. He's not here with us today, but I do want to take a moment to read the dedication that is printed on the inside of the front cover. The 2017 Index of Culture and Opportunity is dedicated to William E. Simon, Jr., whose understanding of the significance of faith and family to free society has inspired a generation of visionary scholarship and a better hope for our future. It's in that legacy that we publish this Index of Culture and Opportunity. Well, to frame a conversation about among all these contributors at this critical juncture in our country, we could think of no one better than J.D. Vance to write the introduction to this year's index. J.D. Vance's best-selling book, Hillbilly Elegy, has captured our country's unsettled moment better than any other description. It vividly tells the story of a family and a culture in crisis based on his own experiences growing up in Ohio in a family that hails from Appalachian Kentucky roots. Even the fact that our cultural conversation has come to identify this unsettled moment can largely be credited to J.D. having given us the terms and the self-awareness as a society to acknowledge and name it. I was looking this up last night, and I think it's only last June that your book came out. Is that correct? It is remarkable and astonishing that this book has been with us less than a year, and yet it has so established itself as a term of reference guiding our conversation about our national social condition. Well, J.D.'s childhood experiences entering the Marines and going to Yale Law School are well described in the book, which many of you have read and enjoyed and learned from. And I hope we'll hear more about some of those experiences today. So I'm going to reserve my comments here to a few things that have happened since the release of the book. First of all, J.D. has centered his life and activities back in his native Ohio. He's become a partner at Revolution LLC. And even more significantly, he and his wife welcomed a baby boy in June. So they have embarked on the great adventure of nurturing opportunity in a new life. Will you join me in welcoming J.D. Vance to Heritage?
So thanks, Jennifer, so much for having me. Thanks to everybody for coming out, and thanks especially to the Heritage Foundation, not just for hosting me, but for hosting an incredible group of people to have an important conversation about culture and opportunity in this country. Now, I said during an interview with the Daily Signal just a little bit ago that I think it's impossible to separate culture and opportunity. You have to understand one side of the coin if you're going to understand the other. And as Jennifer said, we are very comfortable as technocrats and folks who live and breathe the policy world in talking about opportunity as an economic thing, as something that's driven by productivity, labor force participation, all of the metrics that we're very comfortable talking about and measuring in our life as participants in the national conversation. But what we're less comfortable talking about is this question of culture, and that's what I think is so important about this index and about the conversation we're having today. We're recognizing the importance of culture, and most of all, we're recognizing that it influences the opportunities that children who grew up in the circumstances that I grew up in, that it affects their opportunities and it affects their likelihood of upward mobility later on. Now, the question of culture is almost necessarily a loaded term. To talk about culture in the context of opportunity and inequality and upward mobility is to necessarily invite the charge of victim blaming, that if you're talking about culture, you must necessarily be looking at poor folks and saying that their circumstances are all their own fault, and that their culture is to blame for problems that cannot possibly be addressed, cannot possibly be solved, and shouldn't even be talked about, unless to point the finger and condemn people. But I don't think that's how the people in this room think about culture, and I don't think that's how this index of culture and opportunity tries to have a conversation about culture. I think that it's talking about something much more intuitive and much more obvious to anybody who's ever lived in a community like the one that I came from. And that's that the habits and attitudes and expectations that we develop in communities, the way that our families and our family instability imparts both wisdom but also struggle, the ways that our community creates certain values and expectations, those things matter when you're a child growing up in disadvantaged circumstances, that the lessons that you take with you when you grow up in a family like mine, they don't necessarily disappear overnight. You don't have access to educational and economic opportunities and watch everything that you grew up with disappear or evaporate, that those things continue to influence and affect you. They influence you in positive ways, and they influence you in negative ways too. Now, because we're so comfortable talking about the economic metrics of opportunity, we're also very good at actually measuring them and putting a number on them. And that's what I think is so important about this index of culture and opportunity. We're not just talking or having a conversation about culture. That's important, but it's easy enough. We're actually trying to measure what it means. What is the role of welfare, and how much has food stamp use gone up or gone down? What is the role of religious communities in our shared public life, and how has it changed in recent years? What is the role of the stability of the family? These things are necessary to understand because they drive so much of the opportunities that children like me ultimately have. Now, we know that we have a crisis of opportunity in the country. We know from the economic data that children born in the 1940s had about a 90+% chance of earning a better life than their parents. And we know that children born in the 1980s are much less likely to live a better life than those of their parents. That means, in a pure material sense, that those who are born today are less likely to live a better life. But I also think that it means that they're less likely to live a better life along the social and cultural dimensions that actually make a life well lived. Because it's not just about having access to a good job. It's not just about having access to good education. It's about raising your children in a stable home. It's about living a happy and comfortable life. These are the things that made up the American dream when I was a kid. And if those cultural indicators are going in the wrong direction, it means that the American dream is in crisis, not just in an economic sense, that it's in crisis in a much more important spiritual and cultural and social sense as well. Now, I am a conservative, and I've been a conservative basically since I started to care about politics. Now, that wasn't true for most of the people in my family. I came from a classic family of blue dog Democrats, folks who had no problem with the government helping out poor people, had no ideological objection to it, but they started to look around at our community and ask themselves, are the things that the government has been trying to do actually working? Are these well-intentioned policies actually making our lives easier? And the conclusion a lot of people in my family came to is that actually they weren't making things a whole lot easier. But I come to this conversation with that same sentiment. I come to the conversation with a recognition that my grandparents had in the 1940s, that a lot of these problems aren't the fault of poor people, that if we're going to talk about culture, we can't necessarily layer it with we can't treat it as the same thing as a failure of individual responsibility. And I think this is where conservatives must get better in discussing and thinking about and fixing some of these problems. Now, individual responsibility is important. I don't think that we should look at the poor and the disadvantaged they face, infantilize them, tell them that they have no agency in their lives, that they have no control, they have no ability to make things better. That's an incredibly destructive message, and we should all resist delivering that message. But questions of individual responsibility are different from questions of culture. Questions of what I choose to do with my own life are different from where I grew up, from whether I came from a broken home or a broken neighborhood, from whether my grandparents or my parents used or abused drugs. Those cultural questions cannot, and I think should not, be layered with moral condemnation. And the fact that they often are, I think, has destroyed some of the real political capital that conservatives have in talking about these issues. Now, let me put a very personal and very specific spin on what I mean by that. Now, when I was in law school, I went to one of the best law schools in the country. I had this remarkable educational opportunity. I had economic promise as far out as the eye could see. But I also found myself doing so many of the things to my own girlfriend, a woman I loved very deeply, that I promised I would never do. I was angry and emotional. I was too quick to use my temper. I wasn't skilled in marital conflict and how to diffuse these debates. And I could see that the very thing that I thought of as the hallmark of the American dream, a stable home and a happy family, weren't necessarily that accessible to me, that I hadn't learned the most important lesson, which is how to build a successful home and family for your wife and children. Now, it's easy to look at me when I was 26 years old and a student at Yale Law School and say that was his own individual failure. But if you peer back into my life, you would have recognized that from pretty much the moment I was born, I saw a lot of drug use, I saw a lot of alcohol abuse, I saw different people fighting and attacking the people that I loved. I saw an incredible amount of what social psychologists and child psychologists call adverse childhood experiences. Now, those things are cultural. They are social and environmental. I didn't choose as a 4-year-old to watch one of my mom's boyfriends attack my mom, but that's what happened in families like mine, and it had its consequences. I think those on the left do an incredible disservice to the poor. They do an incredible disservice to the idea of opportunity when they fail to acknowledge that these cultural factors matter and that they influence children, the children who grow up in these circumstances. But we've got to do a better job at recognizing that kids who grow up in those circumstances aren't blameworthy individuals, that very often they're kids who had disadvantage, but they had disadvantage in a context that we're not comfortable talking about. They had cultural disadvantage. We've got to be willing to have that conversation. We've got to be willing to measure it. And that's why I think what the Heritage Foundation is doing with this index is so important and so worthwhile. And I hope that it's the beginning of a conversation about culture and opportunity, not the end of it. Thank you. And let's have some questions.
JD, thanks for those remarks, and thanks for agreeing to continue the conversation. I'm gonna ask a few questions of JD, but then I want to open it up to the audience as well for about 15 minutes here. I was really impressed in your book that you were very respectably modest about policy, rushing to policy judgment and policy recommendations. And you can talk policy. We've talked policy, and I know it's not that you don't have any depth there, but you were really trying to, I think, make more complex the social situation and help us in the diagnosis. So I just wonder your thoughts about having framed the conversation that way, and why, if that was intentional, why you did that.
Yeah, well, those of folks in the audience who have ever written a book know that when you talk about social problems, there's an editorial pressure to devote maybe the last third of the project to actually talking about solutions. And I thought that was a little bit artificial, because when I surveyed the landscape and I thought about how truly complex and deep-seated, multi-generational these problems were, that it would be a little cheap to immediately transition to a set of well-read, well-hashed policy prescriptions that I thought maybe might not necessarily help a whole lot. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think that policy could help. I think, in fact, better policy would help a great deal in addressing some of these issues. But I most of all wanted to start a conversation. I wanted to give people a sense of how truly difficult these issues are. And I wanted to create a space maybe where folks could figure out how to address them and how they might think about policy solutions themselves. And I just thought that as useful as prescriptive arguments are, sometimes it's really worthwhile to just describe a problem, to try to really understand where that problem came from and how it self-replicates, and to leave folks to draw their own policy conclusions from there. Like you said, I certainly have my own ideas, but I thought that would just make for a better book, and it would make the reader a little bit, it would enable the reader to engage with the material a little bit easier.
I'd say you guessed right. It's been a very popular book. A lot of conversations started from it. So I'm interested in the course of that conversation that you've had over the last year. And I'll ask two questions about this. One first. People do really have a hunger for, I'd like a fix.
Sure.
We want some neat solutions. And so how have you seen, and we've been through an election cycle where people want some change and want a different, we've been through the 100 days and
Sure.
a certain checklist of items that are supposed to get done. There is an appetite for some rapid change at a policy level. How have you found helpful in conversation to help people understand that we have some near immediate goals, but this is a very long game of
Sure.
cultural change?
Sure. Well, the first point that I make is that we've been trying to attack these problems for 40, 50, 60 years, in some cases longer, and the results don't give us a lot of confidence that rushing into these things is going to make it a whole lot better. That some dose of humility and recognition for how tough this stuff actually is may be the best approach. So that's one point. There are two other points that I often make with folks. The first, and I see a lot of young folks in the audience, there is a tendency, especially among millennials, and I say this as someone on the tail end of the millennial generation, to want to make a really superficial difference among 10 million people instead of a really deep difference with 10 people. There's this desire to pass a piece of legislation that's going to fix these problems, and a real failure to recognize that if you really want to help families like mine, absolutely you should be thinking about federal state policy, but you should also be thinking about maybe going into these communities, nonprofit work with a business organization, and actually trying to be on the ground to address some of these issues. And I think that's just something that worries me a little bit in our political culture, that we're super comfortable talking about big change from 30,000 feet. We're not as comfortable with addressing the small data change that's necessary in the life of a community and on the ground. So I encourage people to think about that really specific, really narrow, but also very deep type of change. And then the third point that I make, and this is something folks who are familiar with the welfare literature may know as secondary trauma, that when you try to address a problem and it's ineffective, you actually destroy the cultural and political capital necessary to solve that problem. That when you go in, let's say, with a solution to the opioid crisis and it doesn't work, you actually make people less willing and less comfortable with spending money or spending any other sort of resource on solving that problem. So if the immediate approach is to rush headlong into these problems, what you may do is not a whole lot of good, and you may destroy the political will that's necessary to spend the money and to spend the resources on making these things better.
That's wise counsel, and I appreciate your statements with regard to relational devotion, that we really need to be focused about those connections. One of the things that makes the conversation we need to have about this so challenging is the values divide that we have in America, and you've lived that, having gone from flyover country to East Coast, very elite institution for your education. Yeah. And that's only gotten worse in the last 9 months.
Sure.
How do we break through that? You must speak to a lot of different audiences. What do you find effective in helping the diversity of people you speak to have something of a common conversation about these problems?
Yeah, so my answer here is probably not going to be satisfactory, but I do think that it's true. And I'll highlight this by telling a story from law school when it was a very small seminar class, and it came out early on that I was an enlisted Marine, that I had some on-the-ground experience with this particular problem. And there was a student who was a very, very sweet person and had never uttered a negative word about anybody in my presence, who turned to me and said, "You were in the Marine Corps?" And I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "I just can't believe that. You just seem so nice." And of course the implication is that if you had served in the U.S. military, you must be some sort of barbarian. But that is evidence of the values divide that you talked about. But what bridged that divide was not any way of talking about these issues, was not an article that she read, but was actually spending time with somebody who had been in the U.S. military. And I think that if you're going to really bridge the divide, the only solution is to have our different political and ideological and geographic tribes actually spend time with one another. I think that means building some of the shared social institutions in our society, like the military, that can actually bring people from different groups together and give them a sense of common purpose. That's the only way to know how to do it. I mean, look, there's nothing that you can read or do where if you live in San Francisco your entire life, or you live in West Virginia for your entire life, it's not going to be tempting to caricature somebody who comes from the proverbial other side. It's just really tough. It's human nature. And that's what worries me most about this cultural divide, is that as a country, we're not living in the same places, we're not participating in the same institutions, military, church, etc. And we've got to fix that if we actually want to close the values divide.
Thank you. Well, let's move to the audience. There's going to be a roving mic, and I would be happy to call on you if you'd identify yourself and speak into the microphone, because that will be used for the internet watchers. Is the microphone available? Let me go ahead and have you, sir, in the front row, speak loudly.
All right. Okay. Your book is actually one of the assigned readings for my spring quarter, so I have very remembered that.
Okay.
And for international students, only been in the States for 2 years, and this election is the only election I ever watched. It's very surprising and inspiring. But I just have one question. In your book, you characterize the white working class American people into like 2 groups. One is like, your grandparents, they're hardworking, they're self-reliant. And the other groups are like your mom and your neighbors. They're like, angry, and there are other sides of features which are totally different, the opposite of your grandparents. So what do you think explains why certain group of people adopt certain features and the other groups didn't?
Well, that's in some ways the toughest question, because pinpointing a single causal factor for why these trends started to go in the wrong direction is really tough, right? So if you look in the 1950s, abolition rates of family stability were actually higher than the national average and now they are much, much lower than the national average. So the national average has been going down, and in Appalachia, the story is actually much worse. It's gone from sort of slightly better to much worse. So how do you explain that causally? So the obvious answer, and I think it is a partial explanation, is that the regional economy in these areas have been hit especially hard. So you have folks who are living relatively precarious lives, and the economy, the bottom fell out of the economy, and all of a sudden you took sort of this cultural precariousness, layered on top of it the fact that a lot of them are unable to get good jobs anymore, and then you have a generation later pretty significant set of social problems. But I'd be lying if I said that was the whole explanation, because I just don't think that it is. And so there are a lot of ideas out there about, what changed our sort of social mindset towards marriage and family stability. I would be lying if I told you I had a really good answer. Now, what I try to do in the book is I try to be a little agnostic about the causal mechanism, because I think it's so hard, because there are probably 36 different things that are all driving in different directions. And so my take on it is, we know where we are now. We can see what growing up in an unstable family does to children, to their life outcomes, to their happiness, and so forth. We've got to deal with it now, and we know where we are, and we know where it leads, and that's good enough for us to have a necessary conversation and hopefully start to make some interventions in these problems. And if you get too caught up in how this happened in the first place, I do eventually think that you find yourselves competing and trying to understand 40 different variables, and it becomes really tough to really identify that single cause.
Yes, right here. Second.
Thanks for being here. I'm Mark Newman. I'm an advisor to L Brands, which is in Columbus.
Sure.
My friends and neighbors at Marine Barracks, Washington, which is just about a mile from here, view your book as required reading, because
That's great to hear.
they've got hundreds of Marines who live in barracks who are 18, 19 years old,
Sure.
and many of them match the conditions. They also tell me that about 10 years ago, the standards were very, very different in terms of being able to get into military service. Today, if you don't have a high school degree, if you were doing drugs, you can't get in.
Sure.
Based on your experience and these other trends, how do you evaluate those factors in the things that you write about and analyze?
Sure, well, that's tough, right? Because a lot of the kids, I think, who would benefit most from the U.S. military are in some ways ineligible, either because they are doing drugs or because they haven't graduated from high school. My sense is that obviously, as much and as powerful as an institution as the U.S. Marine Corps and the broad U.S. military is in the lives of these kids, obviously the first order importance is that it's an organization that's built around the defense of the country, and so the mission has to come first. General Chuck Krulak, who was a commandant of the Marine Corps, said that the Marine Corps does two really important things for the United States. It wins wars and it makes Marines. So the military has to do what it has to do to be able to win wars. But that making Marines piece is really important. And look, there are kids who are in circumstances that I came from where I was very precarious, but I could still qualify. I mean, I still graduated from high school. I passed the year analysis. Those standards were still applicable when I enlisted in the Marine Corps a little while ago. So maybe you're not going to be able to collect every single person who's really, really struggling. The kid who's addicted to heroin at 17 who can't graduate from high school. But I think the military is still a really, really useful and positive social institution for those kids who maybe are not at the very bottom in terms of their social indicators, but are still struggling and could really use 4 years of discipline and support and social capital development and all of the good things that come along with participation in an institution like the U.S. military.
One over here. Yes, we have in the front row, and then we'll go over to the other section.
Hi, my name is Helen Yao. I'm a high school student. My question is, in what aspects do you think that the left has failed the disadvantage in terms of policy?
Well, I think the biggest failure, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, is that, look, I come from a family that really supported the 1960s style Johnson administration. But at some level, you have to look at the statistics and the metrics and say, we've tried really hard, we were really well-intentioned, but what we tried didn't work nearly as well as we thought that it would. In a lot of ways, material poverty has decreased in the country. We do have fewer people who are unable to afford the basic necessities of life, and I think that's an admirable and a good thing. But we haven't done a good job of actually encouraging those who grow up on the bottom to have access to the opportunities that are there at the middle and at the top. And I think the biggest failure, not just on the left, but I do think disproportionately on the left, is a failure to recognize that our welfare state is not very good at promoting upward mobility. So we've got to do new things. We've got to think about these problems in a new way. I don't think that means we should just completely blow up the welfare state and say we shouldn't be helping people at all. But we've got to recognize where we've succeeded and where we failed and be willing to change where we failed. My big worry on the right, not that you necessarily asked, but I have this podium, so I'll go ahead and opine on it anyway, is that I think in some ways we've accepted the terms of the debate, but just said we want to do a little bit less of it. So we've accepted the 1960s terms of the debate. We've accepted all of the basic underlying arguments, but said we just want to spend a little bit less money on the programs that you guys ultimately designed. And I think that there's a real opportunity for those of us on the right to recognize the shortcomings of some of what's been tried and to actually chart an entirely new direction and a new vision. And I think that's where the real exciting opportunity exists on the right now, and I hope that we take advantage of it.
Yeah, this is why your book is so incredibly helpful, because the policy work that we're trying to do at the Heritage Foundation is exactly in line with that. The last 50 years of social policy from the left have misdiagnosed the problem as largely or almost entirely material. And you've given us such a rich picture of the fact that there's vast social and foundational family and community issues going on. So it's been a big help to the conversation in Washington. Let's take one last question over in this section if we can. Do we have any? Oh, all right. We'll come back to the middle. Yes, in the back row, ma'am.
Hi, I've read the book. I loved it. I thought it was definitely a return to a lot of what I grew up with. I was wondering, I know that there is this very deep distrust of a lot of the social institutions that most people think are reliable. The government, people can't even rely on their families or their local community or friends, and the church attendance is down. When it comes to social institutions, which ones should we start with? Which ones should we build, besides the military, as you obviously mentioned?
Well, that's a very important question. Part of the decline and the mistrust in social institutions comes from the ways in which those institutions have tried to tackle the problem but have failed. And so I do think that there's some element of recognizing that we haven't been super successful in approaching these problems with a little bit of humility that would resonate a lot with some of the people that I grew up around, because they would say, okay, these people mean well, they recognize that what's been done in the past hasn't necessarily worked, and we're going to invite them back in because they're actually coming at us with a bit of humility. I think that would actually be helpful, just that broad recognition. Which social institutions to start with? I mean, my inclination is to say all of them, right? And one of the most gratifying and one of the best parts of writing the book and going around and talking about it is that there are a lot of churches who primarily have operations and congregations in middle class and upper middle class areas who say we need to get back to some of the lower income neighborhoods in our own community, in our own town. And so there is a broad recognition from some of these social institutions that it's not that always that people have rejected them. Sometimes it's the fact that they've just withdrawn, that they've spent a ton of time ministering in Guatemala and not a ton of time ministering to people who are in similarly tough circumstances. Obviously, both are important, but I think there is a recognition that we've neglected some parts of our own country and some of our social institutions, and I think that's really important and valuable. But I won't pretend to have the entire answer here, because I do think it's really tough how you rebuild those social institutions and how you actually give faith or provide some confidence at the ground level among the people who most need these institutions, that they're actually looking out for them.
Well, you're absolutely right that this is going to be a long conversation, so we hope this is your first of many visits to continue it here at the Heritage Foundation. I want to thank you for being with us, writing the introduction to the index, and joining us for this conversation today. We're going to let you relax and watch the next panel, but join me in thanking Jake. the contributors of our 30 to the index this year. And in this panel, we're going to take the opportunity not only to reflect on the things JD shared with us, but also to drill down a little bit more into the data and the analysis that is presented in the rest of the index. And I'm so pleased to have with us this panel to do that. So I'm going to introduce them very briefly and the indicators that they commented on, and then we'll just have a wide-ranging conversation for about a half hour, 45 minutes here. So first of all, Helen Alvarez is a professor of law at the Antonin Scalia School of Law at George Mason University. She has written on the divorce rate in our index. Bill Maddox at the end is director of the J. Stanley Marshall Center for Education Options at the James Madison Institute. He's written on unwed childbearing and single parenthood. Next to him is Reverend Derek McCoy, executive vice president of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, also called CURE. And he's written on marriage, which he has a lot of experience with in terms of marriage education. Henry Olson, right here, is senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and author of the just released 3 weeks ago book, The Working Class Republican, Ronald Reagan and the Return of Blue Collar Conservatism. Congratulations on that. He's written on the employment to population ratio. And if you haven't heard as much about that as you have about the unemployment rate, he's going to clue you in. And then finally, my former colleague at the Heritage Foundation, Israel Ortega, who is now spokesperson for the Libre Initiative. He's written on education choice and the growth of minority support for that, and we're excited for all the work he's done. Promoting education and great solutions to the kinds of challenges we're talking about today. So we've got a great panel here, and I'm going to pose some questions to individuals, and then there are some that are going to be open field, and I hope all of you will jump in and interact with one another in addition to responding to me. So this index has both good news and bad news, and we look at indicators according to the last 10 years of change, the 10-year change and whether it's going in a good direction for opportunity or actually closing the doors to opportunity for more Americans. And so some of the good news that is in this index is that we actually have a little bit of a downturn in divorce, Helen. And so I wanted to begin with you, just to kind of put this in context. What's the good news? Maybe it has a caveat and an asterisk beside it.
It does.
Over to you.
So, the good news is, right, divorce rates are down a bit over the last 10 years. And from reading anything that in the ether is all kinds of conversation about the preventability of divorce and the problematic outcomes. And that's been around more or less since the 90s in increasing amounts. The caveats, of course, are that we know that fewer people are getting married in the first place. And that this is more so among the poor and people with fewer years of education. We know that gray divorce is a bit galloping, but let's put that in perspective. It was, it's still much lower than people who are younger, but baby boomers, again, are sort of leading the way in upping the divorce rates. The other thing that I concentrated on in my written portion, my last point, is that the behaviors that we know are not just correlated, but also somewhat causative for divorce are, however, stable or increasing, which are things like rates of cohabitation, and specifically, I mean cohabitation with someone you're not already engaged to and have a marriage date. That is really a risk factor. Divorce, we have tons of increasing amounts of that, and again, more so among those who are less privileged. We have high rates of out-of-wedlock birth, still high rates of premarital sexual partnerships, and porn. And even though there's a great national conversation around all of them, it's really, there's some honesty about these factors in leading journals right and left. They are still perceived to be a matter of private choice, and therefore very hard to get at culturally. And I have work that I'm doing on that I'll talk about another time, but that's the caveat on that. That's problematic.
Thank you. Israel, I want to turn to you because we do have great news on educational choice and its popularity, not only how it's performing, but its popularity.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if we think about education as providing increased opportunity, and you look at, I think what a lot of us already know is that we're increasingly becoming a minority country. What we're seeing is that among that fast-growing group of Americans, there is a lot of support for the idea that parents and families should have say in deciding what kind of education their children get. And so I think particularly interesting to point out left-leaning polling groups that are finding that among Hispanics, school choice support is really high. about how, almost a quarter of all Hispanics live in poverty. And then you look at the trend that Hispanic families are saying, look, we want to have greater say. The public school system is not serving their families well, and I think that's encouraging. But I think what I point out in my essay is it'll be interesting to see how much of this support will be translated into pushing public elected officials to support policies that favor school choice. And right now, I think the jury's still out in terms of how much of that actually is translated into policy.
Thank you. Bill and Derek, let me have you comment in turn on the issue of marriage and unwed childbearing, single parenthood. This is not great news.
So yeah, the data point that I had was all about the number of children in single-parent households, and the news is not good. And the conversation around this has, in some ways, kind of slipped off the radar in some respects. It seems and yet we know from years of research data that children who grow up without the benefit of a father in the home are much more likely to experience all sorts of problems in school, later on in employment, in higher rates of going to prison, and all sorts of other things. And yet, because this is such a difficult problem to tackle, and because there is a concern of victim blaming, there is, I think, a desire on the part of many to try to pretend that we can focus conversations elsewhere and somehow address some of these problems. And they're very deep-seated, and they've been with us for a long time. But hopefully we can find some way to do something about them, because they're not getting any better.
Well, in some of the things that I was talking about around the marriage rates, of course, we understand that they're declining. They're declining overall. People aren't getting married as frequently, as often. And you look at those rates, you look at the trends, and kind of one of the things that I kind of brought about is, and the research is out there, that, you know what, maybe we're not telling the whole truth about this. I think it's a kind of a both-and perspective of it. It's, you can look at it from true statistical research and say, well, parents, when you have a married family, and those kids in poverty are probably around 5.2% as far as families. When you look at it from single-parent households, especially females, it's about 28.2%, somewhere around that. Single fathers are a little bit lower than that, but still, it's astronomically higher than married families. Those are one of those things that, hey, as a benefit to being married, not to just talk about poverty alone, but there are substantial benefits that if you do get married, if you do go down this aisle, literally and figuratively, there are great benefits to marriage. I mean, the other side, as you know, talking about it from just a very practical standpoint, there's a lot of, I think Bowling Green University just did a study not too long ago talking about, hey, there's a lot of expectancy for high schoolers to be married. So that rate is up. At the same time, expectancy and implementation are two different things. Actually getting to the aisle, actually going down the thing and saying I do. I think it's a lot of cultural issues that have taken place that have shifted our value towards marriage in general. And that's not healthy and not good. And we have to look at trying to reverse that.
Wonderful. Let's bring the microphone down to Henry here and have you talk about first of all, just explain what the employment to population rate is, ratio. That doesn't roll off the tongue. And put it in context for us about what the news is.
So whenever you see the media talk about the job labor market, they use the shorthand of the unemployment rate. But the unemployment rate only counts you as unemployed if you're still looking for work. So if you're so discouraged that you're no longer looking for work, you're not counted as unemployed. And you can sort of see some more sophisticated attempts to get underneath that, but they still miss the target. That the simplest way to look at the health of the labor market is to look at the employment to population ratio, which is exactly what it says. Share of people in jobs compared to the percentage of people in the population. Now, the employment to population ratio will naturally drop as the baby boomers age, because we will have a larger share of people 70 who no one expects to work. So what I did for the index is take a look at the employment to population ratio for the population ages where everyone is expected to work, 25 to 54. You're pretty much out of school by then. You haven't been able to be old enough to be expected either through disability or through early retirement. And while those data show that employment is up since the depths of the Great Recession, what it shows is that since the 2000, it's down dramatically, and it was going down even during the Bush recovery. The Bush recovery was the first economic recovery where the employment to population ratio high post-recession did not exceed the employment to population ratio high after the previous administration. Cut to the chase. If the EPR were as high today as it were in 2000, 4.5 more million Americans would be working. Since we know that people with less skills and lower educational backgrounds are more likely to be discouraged or not to find jobs, what we're really talking about is 4.5 million more jobs for the people who have been hit hardest by the changes in the economy in the last 1 year. Imagine a 2016 election with 4.5 more million low-skilled blue and pink-collar jobs. I don't think it's the same conversation.
Thank you. So that indicator of the employment to population ratio is perhaps very intuitive for everyone, that it has something to do with opportunity in general. That's not the case necessarily with these cultural issues. We've talked a lot already this morning about the fact that we're trying to bring this cultural conversation into the economic conversation to have a fuller, more robust conversation about opportunity in general. So I'd be interested just in others on the panel commenting on how you see these indicators of family stability and so on interacting with the horizons of opportunity. You want to start with that, Helen?
You know, there's all this literature.
I think we might, can we check if it's on?
It says it is.
Okay, I'll switch, I promise.
Sorry, we're having a little mic trouble with that mic.
You know, there's all this literature about sort of what it takes economically to tip somebody into marriage, what it takes economically to get people to think about divorce. But I've seen some studies lately regarding the boom in income in working class jobs in fracking. And did it raise marriage? Did it raise marital parenting? And it did not. And so what, I'm thinking about a lot is, and then there's that new book, you may have seen it, called The Marriage Paradox, out of two Brigham Young scholars, Willoughby and someone else. It's an Oxford series about emerging adulthood. And the sort of lack of attachment or attraction to the notion of commitment, to the idea that there is something about a woman being loyal to her husband, a husband being loyal to the wife, that commitment and loyalty and the interest factor in what they can do together in synergy is just not with us as much. The book, The Marriage Paradox, talks about, this what Derek talked about, the desire for marriage, but the inability to accomplish it. And I'm thinking, and then that book talks about individualism and relativism, and when J.D. was talking about attitudes, habits, et cetera. So there's such a mix of the economic and these attitudes, habits, and practices, and the question of who can address them, right? Families can address them, churches can address them, and I do believe at the granular level, you know, Jennifer, I work on projects, I Believe in Love and Women Speak for Themselves, that just go into local communities and get local people to do things for one another. But the difficulty now of the decline of the cultural attraction to the things that form and stabilize a family is what it's so hard.
Well, there's a lot in my mind that we have to keep thinking about, even when, and I really appreciated JD's perspective and his nuance to maybe not to stay away from that last third of the book of making concrete policy decisions. But still, when we're thinking policy, when we're thinking about culture, when we're thinking about what serves our culture the best, we've heard a lot of these things. You have to go back to the fundamental aspect of the family. When you are married and when you have families that are intact, they fare so much better economically, structurally, emotionally, psychologically. I mean, there's, all the way down to the point where you talk to people sometimes, you say, hey, look, did you know that you have less chances of having Alzheimer's and these other diseases if you are married? Now, that doesn't preclude and say you'll never have those issues. Of course, we all know that's not true. But the percentages are just different. And so when you travel down this road, and even your fulfillment side of it in terms of life, now I'm the first one to say, when you do this, it's not an easy road. It's not, one size fits all, just marriage will do it and everything's hunky-dory. No, but culturally, if we understand what picture are we giving best for our kids today? What picture for our young adults and for the ones that are millennials and everybody else, what's the best opportunity that we're giving to say, what's going to help shape culture down the road? What's going to help change some of the societal issues that we are facing? And I think we have to look at it from a policy standpoint. How do we value marriage? How do we put it back into stake and make sure that those things are really fundamentally being addressed in all aspects of society? And I think it's just crucial because economically, we want to change the dial on poverty. And we want to say we have to make a difference here. And one of the best ways is, hey, look, tell parents and tell kids it's not bad to be married. If you look at we talk about this too, and I'll pass this mic, but even from the penalization at times that comes when folks that are receiving government entitlements and government assistance, and they say, well, we're going to now get married, and there's penalties to those at times. That's not good. We got to make sure that we can get them stable, strong, growing, and off the dole, and get them in their place. They have their own sense of dignity, their own sense of personal responsibility, and they're moving forward with their life. So,
I was just going to pick up because when hearing Derek, it got me thinking about the community I work closest with the Hispanic Latino community that I talked to a minute ago. But during the Obama years, there was a time when the Health and Human Services was running a campaign targeting Hispanic communities, essentially saying, look, there's no need to be ashamed of relying on welfare. And I thought that was, and actually at the time I was working at Heritage and we wrote about this and it got some national coverage because, but I think it goes at the heart of, I think, what we're seeing, right, that there are two competing undercurrents. One that is encouraging greater government, increasing the size of the welfare state of the entitlement programs that we have, and another one that is looking more at personal responsibility and family and civic institutions to take the role of government. And I think, that really to me is at the heart of this book and the conversation about culture and opportunity, because when you think about culture influencing public policy, that means that public policy is going to influence the opportunity that we all have.
Henry, I think you had a comment on this.
So one of the things that I've always found valuable about found valuable about JD's work is the sense that if you haven't walked in somebody's shoes, you can't really understand what they face. And one of the reasons Hillbilly Elegy resonated with me is all the things you were talking about, JD, about learning the unwritten cultural norms of elite society. I had to learn too because my parents didn't go to college. I never saw 3 forks on the left side of a plate until I got to an elite institution. So as the only divorced custodial parent on this panel, what I'd like to point out is that what I hear too often, and I'm very pro-marriage, I'm anti-divorce, but what I hear too often is be like me, with no understanding of what actually leads people to divorce or actually leads people to be afraid of marriage, because you come from a healthy background that doesn't allow you to walk in the shoes of somebody. If you haven't had your spouse assault you physically, if you haven't had your spouse bankrupt you because they lied and stole your money and gambled it away, stories I heard on the dating circuit, if you haven't been through a spouse who was mentally ill, you don't know the depths of the problems. You don't know how to reach out to the very people you're talking to. And Lincoln, in his temperance address, addressed the Washingtonians, which is a group of reformed drunkards. And he made a point of telling them that they were more effective in the temperance cause than others because they had suffered from the affliction and hence had credibility with the people. So what I'd urge all conservative marriage advocates is actually meet people walk in those paths to learn it's not all the baby boomers who are just bored with their spouse at 45 or just can't get their act together. There's a lot of real problems that real people face that change circumstances and make life tough. And until you can address that, you're going to continue to see, I think, the decline in cultural indicators that we all lament.
That's a helpful piece of observation, and I'm glad that also with the way you closed it, which is to say, this doesn't, I think what you're saying is, by all means, we should not be silent on this. We
Oh,
need to
no,
talk
what I'm
about
trying
the
to say is
institution.
you need to, well, I'm not trying to say, hey, guess what, get with the times,
Right.
What I'm trying to say is, there are many reasons people don't get married, and it's not all because they're into cultural libertinism. There are many reasons people get divorced, and it's not all because they're bored and they just want to get on with some sort of liberationist lifestyle. There are real people facing real problems that don't happen to everybody, and until you can address that, you will continue to appear as people who do not actually have the best interest of the people to whom you are trying to talk at heart.
That's helpful. Real people and real interactions need to happen for us to find real solutions.
Right.
We've got some comments down the line.
Just really quickly, I know I'll say one comment, and I appreciate that perspective because that's real life. What Mr. Olson just talked about is absolutely real life. Situations happen to people all day long, and you don't want to paint this pie in the sky ideology of just get married and it's all great. Coming from a clergy background and having dealt with multiple hundreds and hundreds of families on a daily basis, and looking at it even now where, just a couple of days ago, we were with about 14 different pastors in the city here that came to the city just to try to hear about different perspectives. And I hear this, and especially in our work with the National Clergy Network, just with understanding where they are. One of the things that you've heard before, even I think Mike McManus wrote on this, but it's so true, as far as just the idea that when you get married, and this isn't a marriage counseling class, this is the panel, but you have to. But I need to address it because this is the crux of this is that one of the things I cited in the article is the old Joy Jones article about marriages for white people, and kind of the analogy that she goes down, but then also understanding the truth about marriage is tough. Marriage is hard. It's hard work. It's labor. Buddy, you got to pull up the bootstraps and put on personal responsibility and take ownership. If you don't, it will fail. And I think, where Mr. Olson is correct, there are so many situations where people's lives are entangled with other issues, and they come with, like I tell my kids, I said, look, you're going to have to find a spouse, but you're going to try to find a spouse that doesn't line up with tons of crates of trunks of luggage that they bring to the marriage. But really getting a mentor spouse, a mentor couple with you, getting some folks that will really help you along the way, being placed in planted places. I think even like what JD was talking about, this is the cultural issue broader, that we have to find these outlets. And I believe in the church, but you find these places in our culture that can be substantive help for you as we are changing the dial and changing the conversation. But if we give up and say, hey, it's tough, it's too hard, and it doesn't work, that's not the answer for our young people.
You want to comment on that, Bill, or shall I next one?
Just holding the mic.
Microphone, let me just call attention to a really very interesting way that you approached the indicator that you were writing on about single parenting and unwed childbearing. And many of the folks who have had a preview copy of the index have really been taken by that. And I think your illustration shows the ripple effects that these social institutions can have through really minor aspects of life that they are far-reaching.
Yeah, I suppose thinking about this, my essay kind of comes out of left field because I talk about baseball, and particularly about my interest in black baseball. I grew up, one of my first boyhood idols was Henry Aaron, who played for the Atlanta Braves, the all-time home run king. And I now live in a city not far from where Buck O'Neil, the great Negro leaguer, was born, as well as Jackie Robinson, born not far from us. And in baseball circles, there's been this robust conversation in the last 10, 15 years about the decline in participation among black youth and how fewer and fewer major leaguers now come from the African-American community. And there's a lot of hand-wringing about this and also a lot of really good humor. HBO had Chris Rock do this rant about this topic a few years ago, which is absolutely hilarious. I highly recommend it. Go on YouTube, find it. And as humor, Rock he touches all the bases. But as sociology, he comes up short in this way. One of the things that's really interesting about the research on why this is happening is that what's happening in the black community is also happening in the white community, which is this. Kids who are growing up in single-parent households, kids who don't have a dad to throw a ball in the backyard with them, are not playing baseball as much as previous generations. And part of the reason for this is that baseball is a highly interactive sport and one in which kids can benefit greatly from having someone one-on-one tutor them. So it's not like track or swimming or basketball where you can often perfect your skills almost on your own, shooting hoops in the driveway or whatnot. Throwing ball, having someone pitch to you, having someone watch a game with you and explain the strategy behind the game, because baseball is a much more cerebral game. It's more like classical music than like jazz. Soccer, basketball, more like jazz. And so kids who don't have dads are at a disadvantage. And in fact, a researcher at the University of Nebraska went and studied this and found it true among select teams at the youth level. At the College World Series every year in Omaha, 95% of the players come from intact two-parent households. And we see this also in the major leagues. And what it illustrates is that we need dads in homes not just to provide greater stability, greater income, but we need them there to interact with their kids. And when kids have access to mom and dad, you see all sorts of benefits in much more significant things than baseball participation. Because come on, let's face it, as much as I love youth baseball, if it went away, it wouldn't be the end of the world the way some of these other things that we're talking about would be. But the other day, I remember I was watering the lawn, and a woman was walking by with her two kids, quizzing them on spelling questions. You know, the daughter was going to have a spelling test that day. They were walking to the school bus to catch the school bus. And there was an interactivity between parent and child taking place there. That's consistent with research that we see that shows that kids who regularly have meal times with their family end up doing better in school. So parents are needed not just to provide income, not just to provide protection or stability, but we need them there because their interactivity provides unique contributions to children, and it shows up not just in all the serious things that we come to Washington and talk about in very serious policy wonk kinds of gatherings like this, but even in things like youth baseball.
This is about both what Bill and Israel said, which is, when government sometimes does stupid things. So when you talk about a policy prescription, I just finished a book on non-marital parenting. And I don't have a third of the book on prescriptions, but the easy one was Stop Stupid. And the stupid part is where the government and HHS did a ton of this over the last 8 years, literally promotes single parenthood. And so they partner with things like the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancies, Bedsider. And they post things on the HHS website that says, you want to be a single mom? That's up to you. Nobody can tell you what to do. It's amazing. I mean, with Planned Parenthood partnership and that, with their material on whether it's contraception or their sex ed material for girls or older, they're just doing stupid stuff. They're basically suggesting that non-marital parenthood is not problematic. So like that, you spoke about sort of putting out a message that's stupid. One of the easy first policy prescriptions is just stop stupid before we get on to the affirmative stuff.
That's great. Very good. And let's as we round out our time here, I would love to keep focusing on what are the things that need to change. If these indicators that you've written on and some of the ones that you know alongside them are going to be different in 10 years or a generation, what do we need to start doing now in policy, in communities, with personal responsibility?
On my indicator, I think we need to understand that the economy's changing in a way that people with capital don't want to invest in giving high-value machines to low-skilled native-born people. It's cheaper to go overseas and do that. And that's going to place a lot of social stress. There's also our entire social safety net is built around a locality-based system that encourages people to stay put in job deserts, so that if you're somebody with low skills and you lead work, you're really only encouraged to look in your local community. But what happens if the jobs are in Texas? You're not encouraged to move, and there's actually huge financial disincentives to do that. So you've got people who are staying put for generations in places that haven't generated jobs since the 1920s, and you've got millions of immigrants whose straits are in Ecuador and Peru and Guatemala are so bad that they will commute thousands of miles for the jobs that are being created in the Rio Grande Valley. Maybe we should think about how public policy is creating two issues at once and deal with that, rather than try and pretend that we still are in the world of the 1920s and that our social safety system is adequate and isn't in fact counterproductive in trying to create first opportunities for native-born people and then providing opportunities for immigrants when the native-born simply can't do the jobs.
Thank you.
I'll just say two things. I think the first is one that JD talked about, which was this idea of just having uncomfortable conversations. I think that needs to happen not just among ourselves, but also among policymakers. And to pivot to policy, I mean, the work that Robert Rector has done in terms of pointing out how two-parent households are the single most effective way of reducing child poverty is one example of something that often does not get talked enough about in public policy circles, and certainly not among folks in Main Street. So that would be one. And I think the second thing would be to get away from this idea that all the answers that for the problems that we have are going to come from Washington. I think thinking about how it's going to come from at the local level, I had a chance last year to interview nonprofits and charities and churches that are doing this kind of work, in some cases travel to their site and talk to individuals who are being helped by these groups. I think that to me gives me hope for optimism in the future.
I'm going to interject one comment, but I hope that all of you will react as we get on the line here. It strikes me, Israel, that the kinds of projects that you were looking at are ones that are successful because they take into account a relationship and the holistic nature of a person, not just the material, but the spiritual, emotional, relational needs of a person. And so often, it seems like even our church ministries and outreach, when it comes to poverty, flatten themselves into material strategies, which is such a shame because it shortchanges the greatest capital that a church has, which is relational. It's built on a relationship. So how do we open the imaginations of those who have relational capital at a local level to start really using that in tackling the problems? Can we ask the Reverend comment on that?
Well, that's a great question, and you're so right. I think we do look at it in a flat line kind of perspective and don't really maximize it. I think some of the things that we could probably do, I look at it like this. The simplicity of it is we have to think, and I know this is so cliche-ish, so please forgive me, but when you say, man, you got to think outside the box, but you do have to think with a lot of ingenuity today. Culture has changed from the way that we interact with technology, the way that, everybody in this room that's, under that 30 mark and are in the 20s and maybe lower, they're thinking totally different from technology and how you actually interact with people. And I think one of the things that the church can really learn and maybe other institutions can learn is to take advantage of these things and let's figure out ways that we can make it better, make our learning practices better, make our creative practices where we get people involved, engaged. One of the challenges, too, to this whole technology piece is that we're not as engaged at times relationally with one-on-one conversations and talking to people. And I think JD had mentioned, hey, we can think at this macro level, 30,000-foot level, but you know what? Some of our real change is going to happen, right here in front of us with the 10 people in our home and trying to really make a difference. And I think we're going to have to go back to what I call the small group strategy stuff and really trying to get with people individually, talking to them, and making a difference. Because even when you're looking at how do you stop items, it's going to be by the one-on-one interaction. It's almost like playing the baseball. The reason why the baseball strategy works and the dad being there, because as he's throwing the ball back and forth, what conversations are taking place? How can he now challenge his kid? Because he's now spent copious hours. He's invested something. And when he's invested that time, that kid is a whole lot more willing to listen to dad and to say, you know what, that's my role model. That's my hero. And I think the same thing from all of our institutions, socially and church-wise and everything else. We have to build the credible capital in our pocket, so to speak, to be able to spend it in our relationships. And that really comes with time, effort, and it's no short-term, magic pill that I think we could take right now in our culture. But I tell you something, if we don't look at this thing and say, we have to create a new paradigm and really challenge people to think this way and think differently and think towards marriage, think towards, big campaigns on abstinences out there, but it's not abstinence towards marriage, it's just abstinence and just wait until. Wait until what? Wait until you just get older and you can think about it differently? Well, that doesn't work. I mean, there's proven stats that says, hey, look, if you are married, guess what? You're going to likely enjoy sex more and have it more frequently. That's kind of almost counter, people say, well, that doesn't make sense. Yes, it does, because you have a long-term committed relationship. And that's what most people want. And my last point is, just like I said when I started in some of that article, when I do marriage retreats and they raise their hand, I say, how many people here were excited about being married? Yep. How many people here want to be married? Yeah. How many people want to be divorced? I don't get one hand. Never have gotten one hand. Because ultimately, where they are personally, they want to build a legacy. They want to build a family. They want to make a difference in their culture. They want to see their kids do well. They want to see their kids do better than themselves. But something happens along the way that breaks that down. And I think, like Helen was saying, there's so many countercultural messages that are affecting us that we buy into, that we gotta, one, stop the stupid and create something different. So sorry, being long.
Bill, Helen, closing thoughts?
Well, since I've talked already about baseball, let me just say in terms of recommendations, I'll continue with the sports theme and just say, I think we need in our public life to bring the culture of sports more and more into play. And by that I mean, when you look at how sports is organized and why we respond to it, there are a lot of really interesting lessons embedded in it that I think could be really helpful to our politics. So, for example, the emphasis on equal opportunity, of everybody starting at the same starting line, but not caring as much. In fact, we don't want in sports an outcome where everybody crosses the finish line holding hands at the same time. We want and encourage competition, but we want a level playing field, and it's a level playing field that takes into consideration disadvantages that some might come to the playing field with. We have special rules for expansion teams and things of that nature that I think take into consideration some of the hardships that might have, in the public policy realm, might have come to certain people from various cultural backgrounds and whatnot. Jason Whitlock, who is now with Fox Sports, used to be with ESPN, was recently asked to comment on why ESPN is losing so many conservative viewers because of the kind of growing pushing politics into the sports coverage. And one of the things he said was really interesting. He said, sports is a culture that hates whining and that hates excuse making and that has this mentality that whatever the obstacles in front of you, you put one foot in front of the other and you do your level best to try to succeed. And we need more of that mentality in our public life. Recognizing that, there are folks that have disadvantages and that we need as rules makers to take those into consideration and to give everyone a fair shot. But the main thing I tell you, as someone who doesn't live here in Washington, that I'd really like to see is for those who are public policy makers to increasingly see themselves more like umpires and referees who are trying to make things fair for everyone, rather than as stars and players. Because the truth of the matter is, none of us ever go to a sporting event to see the umpires or the referees. And when they regulate too much and get in the way and hinder the flow of the game, we hate it. And speaking as someone from outside Washington, I'd really like for politicians to learn that lesson.
I'm going to say something, it sounds like a plug, but it's meant for the common good. That's honestly 2 projects that I work on, which I was kind of very proud, your Jennifer and JD conversation about going granular. I wished I had done these when I worked with the U.S. bishops and had money at my disposal, but instead it's a nonprofit. But there's one called Women Speak for Themselves, one called I Believe in Love. I Believe in Love literally goes into working poor communities, working with single moms, cohabiting couples, and tries to help bring them through writing under an editor to the realization of how good it is to have stability, loyalty, marital childbearing, and so forth. And we have 2-3 entries a day of people writing about their story to move themselves toward that. And I think it's a really good granular example. Women Speak for Themselves. Basically, the people in whose name the sexual and familial revolution got going are writing about how it immiserates them, and so all we do is empower them to do local stuff. So I'm pleased to hear that. I think that's the direction. I was pleased to hear you both mention it.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I want to thank this panel for enlightening us with their helpful perspectives, this idea of earning the credibility to speak to these issues, whether at a popular and public level or at an individual life level, is very important. Having the real conversations that will get to the heart of the matter, and the tools that, like those that Helen's just mentioned, that each of them are working on. These are very exciting developments, and I think something that will help us over the long term as we watch these cultural indicators for the future. I want to say a few things in closing before you leave here. Each of you is able to take a copy of the 2017 Index of Culture and Opportunity on your way out. It's also available online, and we encourage you to link to it and promote it on Twitter and social media and your Facebook and any other website you may have access to. The URL for it is heritage.org/culture. And we'll be moving out from here, and there'll be you'll be able to gather further in the lobby here to talk to some of our guests today. Will you please join me in thanking our panelists?
So,